the cloud. All right, so today's class is going to, we're doing part 2 of how to write papers time. Basically, last time was how to turn a prompt into a thesis. This time is how to turn a thesis into a plan. Next time is going to be how to turn a plan into a paper. This class is not going to take the whole time. So basically, after last class, you should have a collection of 8 theses, potential theses. If you haven't turned it in yet, get it in when you can. I'm not going to be too strict about it, but just turn it in. And then what you do now is you choose, I guess what you basically have to do is choose one of those theses to write the entire paper on. You're just writing one paper. The other 7 that you don't want to write on, you can forget. Just ignore them. They're not important anymore. The question now then is you have this one sentence. How do you turn one sentence into an entire 3 to 5 page paper? And the middle step is how do you turn one sentence into a few sentence plan and a structure that is going to allow you to accomplish your overall goal of convincing a reader why your particular thesis is correct for the reasons that you mentioned in your thesis. So I think you can generally, the overall planning stage, I think can be broken into a few steps. These first 2 are basically brainstorming ones. The first thing you do is you look at your thesis and you remind yourself, what did you say in it? And try to understand. So you've said, say, you've decided the thesis you want to write on is, I don't know, Carl K. Carlson should be allowed to start his neo-Nazi website. So you remind yourself, what is it I said? And what were my reasons for it? Am I going to be talking about free speech? Am I going to be talking about this? Or imagine another case, just so I don't give away how to write an actual paper prompt. Imagine that one of the prompts was the footbridge trolley problem case. So imagine the prompt is, imagine you're walking along on a footbridge. All of a sudden you see a train coming. If no one stops the train, it's going to hit 5 people. Your only choice is to push someone in front of the train. Should you push someone in front of the train? And imagine you decide you want your thesis to be, yes, you should push this person. So remind yourself, what is your thesis? Yes, I should push this person. And then remind yourself what your reasons are. And say your main reason is, reason 1, utilitarianism says that I should push this person. And my second reason is the only reason you think you shouldn't is because human beings are biased towards things which are actually of no moral relevance. Like the cuter an animal is, the more we generally care about it, even if it doesn't feel pain as much as something that's ugly. Where you think like maybe you should only save animals if they're feeling pain, but it seems like we're far more likely to save cute animals and care. Like, it's a lot of things about saving the kittens and the puppies and not so much about like the ugly wild pigs that's tusks grow through the top of their noses. So my argument, my 2 reasons would be, all right, I'm going to use utilitarianism and I'm going to show that people make their decisions in stupid ways. So this gut feeling we have that it's wrong to push someone should be ignored. I then ask myself, once I've done that and reminded myself what my reasons are, the next thing is I now ask myself, what background would someone reading this paper need? And this is a way of asking yourself, what sorts of key terms or key ideas am I going to want to include somewhere in my paper? So this imaginary prompt I just came up with, what would be some of the key ideas I would have to explain somewhere in order to get someone to understand my argument? Specifically key definitions, if I'm trying to define it in terms of the utilitarianism says the greater good and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, I just have to say what utilitarianism is the first thing. So that's going to be the sort of thing. If it's the Carl K. Carlson starting his neo-Nazi website, what are some of the key terms you're going to want to bring up to make sure that your reader knows what you're talking about? What are some of the key ideas associated with whether or not you should be allowed to sell neo-Nazi merchandise? What is the amendment that it's tied into? Yeah, hate speech. So you'd want to say, before I get into this topic, things you're going to want to bring up are hate speech or free speech or the First Amendment. The Krogan one about the mean alien species who beats up things. If you're going to write a philosophy paper on this, what's a key term you might want to bring up and define?
Cultural relativism.
Bingo, Ryan. Yep, cultural relativism. So that's the other thing you're doing, is when you're thinking about this, you're asking yourself, what are my various reasons going to be? Just to remind yourself. And also, what are the other parts I'm going to want in my paper to make sure that the person understands it? Because remember, you're trying to plan ahead of how can I put things on a piece of paper so that somebody else listening or reading this thing in the future will be able to understand why I think this is true and be inclined to agree with me. So once you do that, you've now thought about the various parts you're going to need in your paper, the reasons, and then you start to think, how should I organize this thing? You've got what your reasons and the ideas are, you've got what background you're going to need, and then you have to think about how to organize. And generally speaking, I find, and this is not the sort of thing that is necessary to follow, but I generally find in any sort of argumentative paper, or really any sort of argument. Wait, am I so bright that you can't see the board online, people? I feel like the board is completely invisible.
Yeah.
Is it invisible?
Yeah,
Okay,
at this point, it just like randomly brightened up. Yeah.
Is it more visible?
Much better.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, then we'll keep it like that. That's, I hate lights. We should live in darkness and all be vampires. All right. So what I want to talk about now is, generally speaking, with an argumentative paper, how to approach, or one useful structure or one thing to use as your baseline and then expand from. So this is generally how I think about approaching a paper like this. I think of it as being able to be divided into parts. And each part has a particular purpose in the argument. And remember, the ultimate goal is to convince somebody to agree with your thesis. So just thinking about it conceptually, if you don't, let's not look at this yet, just think about it conceptually. If you're trying to convince somebody of a certain position on a certain topic, what is the first step in trying to convince them of your position? So right now, I'm thinking about something that I'm going to try to convince you of. Yeah, so but even before I tell you what my stance is, what is it exactly? Like right now, I'm thinking that I'm going to try to convince you that New York City is the best city in the United States. But if I don't say that at the start, there's no way you're going to be able to follow along with my argument. So the first step is in a first paragraph of a paper. Before you do anything else, you need to describe the case / what's at issue. So in the case of these prompts, what you basically have to do first is just describe the little vignette that I made up. Because before you can argue why Carl K. Carlson shouldn't be allowed to start his website, you need to talk about who this made up person is and what he's trying to do. Before you can argue that the Krogan you shouldn't judge them and they're morally okay, you need to say who the Krogan are. Before you discuss whether Don or Joe is correct, you need to tell me who these people are and what they're arguing about. So that's the first step. And this is generally, now, this is how exactly you go about it is up to you. Different people like to write in different styles. If you're somebody who wants to start with like a general statement, that's fine. Got it.
If I spoke about the Krogan one, would I have to talk about, like, I guess Mass Effect as a brief opening?
You don't necessarily have to. If you want to, you're welcome to. Like you can say like within this universe, but you do not necessarily have to. The key is, what would somebody need to know to understand who this species is? So if you think your argument is going to make more sense if you describe the Krogan within the context of Mass Effect, feel free to do that. But if you think that you can just cherry pick them out and make the point just as clearly, then you're also welcome to do that.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, it's a matter of thinking, what would a reader need? So you don't need to tell me everything about the situation. You just need to include the parts that are crucial for getting across your ultimate argument. So you'll want to mention what is happening here. Once you've done that and given the background, so in the imaginary case of I'm imagining the footbridge case of pushing someone, I'd begin by describing I'm walking along one day and then all of a sudden there's a train coming, blah, 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 blah. I just describe it. And that's the first step in explaining your argument. As soon as that's done, you're going to give your thesis. And the thesis is whatever it is that you decide to go with, one of the ones you have specifically, an updated version of them, just something in which you say, what the main claim you're arguing for. And you want this to be early in the paper. I think I mentioned this last time, but your thesis is the thing that the rest of the paper is designed around. And so the earlier you tell your reader what it is, the easier it makes your paper to follow along with. Part of the reason that murder mysteries are fun is because they're hard to follow along with, but that's not what you want in an argument. You're not trying to convince someone in a murder mystery story, you're trying to entertain. Here, you're trying to convince me of something. So if you tell me in line 4 that what you're going to be discussing is why global warming is real, then it's going to be easier for me to follow everything else you say, because if there are any gaps in what you say or words you forget, I'll be able to reconnect back to what your initial thesis was. So I'll be able to go, I'm not quite sure what they mean by this, but I know they're arguing. I don't know what they mean by the poles are melting. Like, I look around and the poles on the street look totally fine. But I know they're talking about global warming. So, oh, they probably mean the North Pole and the South Pole are melting. Oh, I'm able to follow now and it makes more sense. So you want to include your thesis in the first part. As soon as you describe the case, then the thesis. And then the last thing I want to talk about is a game plan. But before we discuss the game plan, I'm going to discuss the other part. So the first part of a paper is explaining what you're doing and what position, or what you're talking about and what position you're taking on that issue. Does that make sense to everybody? And I put up here one paragraph, but generally speaking, so basically you want your thesis somewhere on the first page in an argumentative paper, because it's, again, you want your reader to know where it's going before you get there so they can follow along. No worries. Whether your intros, I have one paragraph because usually that's how it is, but you could do it in 2, you could do it in several numbers, which is part of the reason why I have this divided into parts instead of divided into numbers of paragraphs. Because as we're going to talk about in a second, paragraphs, there's confusions about them.
What's in red?
That says, that's supposed to say 1 to 2 paragraph symbol. So it's a double P, which is somewhere along the line is how either I completely decided to start describing paragraphs entirely on my own, or I feel like at some point that was a symbol for paragraphs and I'm not totally making it up. Okay, so yeah, so that's the symbol for paragraph. So what I'm saying is the first part is 1 paragraph, maybe 2 paragraphs. The second part is the part in which you give the background. And so before you start getting into the core of an argument, you want to mention any key terms that someone is going to be able to understand. So for instance, if you want to say that somebody should be allowed to start a neo-Nazi website because otherwise you're violating their free speech, well, before you could make that argument clear, you need to ensure that your reader knows what free speech is and why it's important. So in my utilitarianism one, I would have to, and so actually I put up the example. So if I'm writing this imaginary utilitarianism paper, the first part, I describe the footbridge case. Then I'd include my thesis, which is in this paper, I will argue that one should push the person off the bridge to save however many people, because utilitarianism is right. So imagine that's my thesis. Well, then my next paragraph or the next part is going to be this part will describe utilitarianism and explain why it's a good theory. So that's what goes into this background bit. So if you're doing the free speech one, this is where free speech would go. If you're doing cultural relativism, that's where cultural relativism would go. If you're going with polarization, that's where polarization would go.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So you just like stop what you did before and you're like, let me explain what this is. Only definite, like just definition.
So here's the way that I think it can you see this part online, people, right? This part of the board where I'm circling. Is this visible? Okay. I'm not getting any no's, so I'm gonna go with yes. This right here is what I call a signpost. A signpost is a sentence at the start of a paragraph that explains where you are in the argument. And what the purpose of these sentences is to avoid that sort of jarring feeling that Netta just talked about. So if you're reading along and I say, describe the case, and I've been like, in this paper, I'm going to argue that you should push someone off of a footbridge to save 10. And then I just immediately go, utilitarianism is the view that blah, blah, blah. It's going to feel very jarring. So what you want to do to transition, so it's very important for the sake of your argument that you do describe what utilitarianism is. Otherwise, someone won't be able to describe your argument. However, in that paragraph, rather than just jumping straight into the definitions, you're going to want to include a topic sentence or a signpost. So rather than just jumping right in, you can start with something like, but before we can begin to understand my arguments, it's necessary to define certain key terms that I'll be relying on later. That sort of sentence here, these transition sentences can make things, and these are things you're going to want to use. This is one of the few things that applies universally to all nonfiction writing in a lot of cases. You wouldn't necessarily want this in a story, but in nonfiction writing of any sort, be it descriptive or argumentative, it can be helpful to include these sorts of things. So also, like, imagine I was writing a history of the city of New York. I could begin with, in order to understand the history of New York, it's worth first looking at the history of Manhattan and the native tribes that lived here. Those sorts of topic sentences or transition sentences can be really helpful. So generally speaking, what I'm talking about here is what you are doing overall in the paragraph or the part of that paper, with the assumption which being that you will transition into each of these parts using signpost sentences or transition sentences. So in this, you'll want your background definitions, key stuff, and you'll get into it using a signpost. So does that make sense? Does that make a, so it can, and one of the things that separates the solid papers from the very good ones is how well do they transition in, like, it takes skill to recognize and to keep your paragraphs or your parts of your paper organized. It is important to recognize that your reader is going to need to know certain background definitions. So it's good to make sure to include those things. It takes another level of presentation to go from recognizing what the reader needs to recognize to also knowing how to present it in the way that's going to be clearest to them. So again, this goes back to thinking, if I were never having heard of utilitarianism before and never having heard of the footbridge, what would I need somebody to say to me so that I could understand what they're saying? So you think I need to know what utilitarianism is. And I'd also want somebody to ease me into a discussion of definition so it doesn't feel so jarring. I'm going to leave up this signpost and we'll talk about a few more. All right. So that background stuff is generally speaking 1 to 2 paragraphs. Then you jump into your reasons. So these are the things that were hinted at in your thesis. So this is kind of like a sidestep, and then you're back on the main track. So in the case of our imaginary utilitarianism prompt, the first reason would be something like, so this would be in part 3. In this part, I will apply utilitarianism to the bridge case. So in this part, I would explain why it is that utilitarianism, the view that I said was good in the last case, leads to the conclusion that I should push someone off a bridge, even if it involves causing a direct murder. So in the Krogan case, your first reason might be that cultural relativism dictates that you shouldn't judge these people. So that would be your next part. Now, why is it that there is a question mark paragraphs here? Well, here's the dirty little secret about writing papers. How many paragraphs should be in a paper? No, exactly. That's the correct answer. The correct answer is a shrug or it doesn't matter. The correct answer is technically it needs to have however many paragraphs you need it to have. And same thing, how long should a paragraph be? It depends on what you need the paragraph to do. You can have a 10-page long paragraph if that's what you need in that point in the paper. You can have a 1-sentence paragraph if that's what you need. So in terms of the background, what is the point of a paragraph? Why do we use them? Why is it that you bother indenting when you're writing a paper? Why isn't it just one big block of text?
It's like organizing sections.
Exactly. It's organized. It's so your reader has an easier time following along. That's the only purpose of them. There's no grammatical reason that they exist other than just to signal, oh, we're changing topics here, or oh, we're doing a slightly different thing. So it's just a signal. You could do it instead of having actual indents. You could just write topic change. That would work just as well. It's just that it signals there's a change in gear. So in your background section, how many paragraphs you need is going to depend on how much background you're giving. In your reason one paragraph, it's going to depend on how much you need to bring in. So if you're arguing specifically that if all you're doing is saying, here's how utilitarianism applies to this case and means that the right thing to do is push someone, you could probably do that in a single paragraph. If by contrast, say we're talking about a prompt that says, let's explain why New York's the best city in the United States. And your first reason for it is that New York has the best food of any city in the United States. Well, then you probably want a few paragraphs, one in which you discuss the quality of the food, another one in which you discuss the diversity of the food, where both of those are subparts to this first reason. So that's why it's a question mark paragraphs. But what you want to do, now you could probably include those in a single paragraph, but generally speaking, you want to, whenever there's a subtle change in topic or you're doing something slightly different, you just want to signal it if for no other reason than to yourself by just changing and adding a new paragraph.
So for part two, we're basically laying down facts to support the thesis that we do in the first part.
So here's the best way to think of it. These are the facts you need to appreciate the facts that you're going to give to explain your thesis.
So let's say we have utilitarianism, or just like multiple different sort of overarching ideas. Can we make each of those a paragraph?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So in this, you could, if theoretically you wanted to talk about utilitarianism and deontology and virtue ethics and nihilism, each one of those could be their own paragraph. Yep. And this is where it's really a feel thing of just like you have to, and this is why it's impossible to teach writing easily, just because, and different people have different approaches and different things. And the other thing is, because there's so many different ways of doing it, trust your gut. Like if the simple reason you want to do it one way is it feels better for you, go with it. Like generally speaking, here's just a general thing about my teaching of papers generally. I would much rather you write something that you wanted to write, because it is clear to me when you wrote something that you found interesting and wanted to write. And if that means you're taking risks that you wouldn't normally take if you were trying to write a perfect paper, I will take that into account. So if you go with something that this is interesting to you, so you go and run with it, it might not be as clear as it would have been if you hadn't run with it, but I will certainly take into account that you took the risk and followed your gut and went with the curious approach into account during the grading. So if you write a terribly unrisky paper, the level of clarity you need to bang it out of the park is higher than if you're you want to bring in something, you want to include a childhood story that you think is relevant, and you can explain this childhood story about what happened when you were young really shows how important it is to have free speech. Perfect. Include it. Go for it. And that's what we'll be talking about more next class, is how can you decide how to flesh these reasons out in a way that will be interesting and is something you like. But generally speaking, what you're trying to do in each part is cover whatever reason it is that is going to be one of the things that's supporting the thesis. Then, how many reasons do you need? Again, it depends on the paper. It depends on your gut. It depends on how you do it. So for instance, if it's a paper on cultural relativism and you want to explain in depth exactly how cultural relativism applies to the Krogan case and why it proves we shouldn't judge the Krogan in extreme depth, you could probably get by with just one reason and have everything, just a bunch of paragraphs tied around that. Another way you can have a couple reasons. So I imagine in this footbridge case, I'd imagine two reasons. The first one is why utilitarianism says you should push it. And my second reason is why an opponent who says otherwise is wrong. So there are generally two different ways you can argue for something. You can either say, here's why I'm right, or here's why the other person's wrong. So you can either go on the attack or you can defend. And so in this, I was thinking of it as having two main reasons: the pro-utilitarian reason, which would probably be one paragraph, and then this part in which I probably two paragraphs where I lay out what an opponent would say, and then a second paragraph in which I respond and say why that reasoning is bad. And then the final bit of any paper is just the conclusion. And now, what is in a conclusion is worth just briefly mentioning. It doesn't have to be much. It's literally just I've now argued that blah, 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 blah. And you just basically restate what your thesis was in other terms. The only thing you really need with a conclusion, its main purpose is just to remind the reader like, oh, this is what I just did. Hey, you may have gotten up and went to the bathroom in the middle, so here's a reminder. Or like, hey, here's a signal that I'm done now. We've reached the end. Yay. Go about your business. And so these are really only a couple. The main thing about a conclusion is just that you have one to signal that you've finished. And usually a conclusion doesn't have to be more than like a single few sentences. But the real meat of the paper, I mean, the thesis is the most crucial sentence. A paper can be very hard to follow if you don't define your key terms. Now, you can sometimes integrate them, okay, into your reasons, but that takes a lot more right. I have never personally had the writing ability to do that. You have to be an excellent writer in order to weave things in a way that doesn't feel like you're jumping around. So I generally find it useful to define things early and then reasons. And the key thing, which we'll talk more about next class, is you want to organize it so that you cover all your reason one in one place, then all your reason two. And so what you can think of with this game plan is now you have a plan for the overall paper. Now all you have to do when writing is put this to the side and just follow the instructions. Oh, this section, I have 1 to 2 paragraphs in which I give background definitions, etc. Now, my reason one, my thesis said my reason one is the importance of free speech. Okay, well, I just talk about free speech. And this one, I talk about a response somebody else might have. Or I might say free speech in this one and the importance of democracy in this one, something like that. Or you might say, if you're arguing against Carl, you could say something like, 1, hate speech causes a lot of emotional pain. That would be a section. And then another section on it's going to lead to people shooting up mosques or something like that. So those would be your different reasons. But that's the general idea. Once you've done this, if you can do this well, you've got a very solid paper. Skeletons are one of the biggest mistakes people make when writing a paper is you sit down, you panic, and you just start word vomiting. And the issue with that is, even if you're the most beautiful writer in human history, you need a good skeleton in order, like, no matter how attractive a person's, skin tone is, if they have no bones in them, they're literally just going to be a pile of flesh on the ground. In the same way, a good paper, no matter how beautifully written, is not going to stand up if you don't have structure underlying it. Are there any questions about this game plan?
Should we not introduce the ideas that we're going to talk about part 2 for part 2?
So here's what I generally say. I'd say you can mention them. It's just you don't want to dive into too much depth until you've given the thesis. So just to give an example, if we're doing this project, you're probably going to want to mention utilitarianism in paragraph 1, but you're not going to want to. So if you're describing the footbridge case, you're not then going to want to give like a full paragraph long description of utilitarianism and how it responds to various things without first having said what you're going to say about the footbridge case. So sometimes what people will do, which ends up making the paper much harder to follow, is they will give the entire definitions before giving the thesis. And so then the best way to describe it is, as the reader, you get whiplash. You're reading along and you're like, okay, footbridge, what are we going to say about, oh, wait, we're defining utilitarianism. Oh, we have to find, oh, now we're back on the footbridge. And so it can just be very difficult to follow. So you just kind of have to think, how much do I want to bring up in this case? And it's very tough because there's no hard and fast rules around it. It's a feel thing, and that's why writing takes practice.
Do you think there's any appeal to stating something and then the reader not knowing what it is, and then quickly after that paragraph it's completely explained, like, oh, now I know
it depends on how you do it. It depends on how much a full understanding is required earlier. Like if you give a full argument of relying on free speech and like the importance of it and blah, 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 and only after you've gone through the whole argument, bring up oh, by the way, this is what I meant by free speech. The reader reading the paper would have to then go back up to re-understand what it is. Because again, as I said last time, assume your reader is a complete idiot. It's the best way to ensure that you are writing in a way that, another way, just assume they're trashed. Just assume they are very drunk when reading your paper. And that will also ensure that you are presenting it in an extremely clear way. Because the goal is, now you can't, of course, like, you have to assume they have some baseline knowledge. Like if they don't know what humans are, like you can't take all the time to explain it to them, but you can guess they might not know key philosophical terms or things like that. And the same way, and we'll talk more next time about how you can explain things in enough clarity, because the goal is, again, not to say something that's true, but to say something that even someone who's only partially knowledgeable of the topic would be able to now understand it fully. And so we'll talk more next time, but the first step in this is the structuring. Now, in terms of the assignment that you have for, what day is that, Tuesday? It's basically just, it's basically just this. Plus you write a signpost for each part. So basically what it is what you do in paragraph 1. And, oh, I forgot, I need to describe game plans. I'll describe game plans in 1 second. But what you do is you basically say, describe the part of like a little bit on what you're going to include at the start, and then just put your thesis. And then you write part 2. I may have in the prompt said paragraph, like described by paragraph. You don't have to worry about that level of specification, as long as I've seen that you've put some thought into how the overall structure will be. So you would say part 2, this part will describe utilitarianism and explain why it's a good theory. My signpost will be, before we begin, however, it's necessary to define utilitarianism and say why it's a good theory. Then for part 3, I would say something like, this part will apply utilitarianism to the bridge case. My signpost will be, now that we know what utilitarianism is, we can see how it applies to the bridge case and leads to the conclusion you should push someone. Then this part will be, this is the part where I'll consider what an opponent would say and respond. My signpost will be, now someone might object against this and say that it's just clearly wrong to push someone off a bridge. That would be a perfectly fine signpost, just something to signal your transitions. Now, the last thing I have circled is a game plan. How many of you have played sports at some point in your life and had a coach? Anybody? Or I guess any sort of activity in which you have a coach or a leader. Before you get out there, what do they do? Yeah, they motivate you, and what else do they do? They're not just like,
They give you a game plan.
Yeah, they give you a game plan. And in that game plan, they're telling you what the plan is. They say, all right, you're going to do this, and you're going to go do that. That's what a game plan is in a paper. It can be useful at the end of your first paragraph, or as by itself as a separate paragraph, to have something that literally says, in this paper, I will argue that one should push the person off the bridge, the same 10 people, because utilitarianism is right. To do this, I will first define certain key terms that will be used later. I will then explain how utilitarianism applies to the bridge case. Finally, I will consider how an opponent might respond to this and explain why that view would be wrong. That's all I mean by a game plan, is basically just saying what you're going to do before you do it. Game plans are completely optional. The reason I bring them up, though, is when you're writing a paper, they can help you keep track of where you are in the writing process. So most people do not write an entire paper sitting down in one sitting. Even those of you who write it the night before usually at least get up to get a drink of water or go to the bathroom. And when you get up and go to the bathroom, you might, you're probably not writing unless you're a weirdo like me, you're not writing your paper in your head as you're walking around. So because of that, it's useful to be able to go, wait, which part of the paper am I in? Let me read oh yeah, this is the part in which I'm defining utilitarianism. It's just a game plan also if your reader is a complete nincompoop and you've told them exactly what you're about to do, it makes it even easier to follow along. For that, the nincompoop can follow along. So those are the main things I want to talk about, how to structure game plan. And the assignment basically is what I am asking for on Tuesday is this plus a signpost here, a signpost here, and a signpost there. So it's this plus 3 more sentences would be the example. That's all. And again, you don't have to stick perfectly to it on the final copy. It's just to practice coming up with plans. Even if you were to decide after you came up with a whole plan, like if you come up with a whole plan and then you decide, God damn it, I hate this. I want to write on a different prompt. Just turn in this one and then worry about the other one later if you're crunched for time. All right, are there any other questions, comments, concerns, feelings on papers?
Should part 2 be devoid of like all opinion?
Generally speaking, try to keep the descriptive parts descriptive and the argumentative parts argumentative. But like everything else, there's going to be some gray areas and some like you can like if you're drawing on some other notion. So for instance, if you were just defining free speech in this, you're allowed to talk about why free speech is a good thing generally. So if you're defining it here, then you don't necessarily have to save for the next one why in general free speech is good. It's rather you want to save for the argumentative part how it proves this particular case.
So it could be like the benefits of free speech.
Generally speaking, yeah, you want the more important thing is the second part is just kind of general defining the things people would need before you like hammer it home in the particular case. Because the goal is ultimately to smack your reader over the head with your specific reasons so much that by the end, nobody, no matter how dumb, would be able to not appreciate that you gave them some good reasons. And again, whether you convince me at the end is not the determining factor of whether you write a good paper. It's whether I can appreciate like, huh, damn, you have a pretty good case. I'm not sure if I agree with it, but that was pretty damn good. Like I've had, I'm perfectly happy to give, and in some ways I find it easier to give good grades when I disagree with someone when it really stands out. Because when I can be like, I disagree with you, and yet I still recognize it's a damn good paper. Any other questions, comments, concerns, feelings? All right, I'm gonna stop the recording. Online people, go and enjoy your online lives. Human people, get home safe.